All right. Shalom. Welcome back. Your sister ChayaFyah here again with some more Sister for Sister story time. We are still reading the book When God Was a Woman by Merlin Stone. We are on chapter 7, The Sacred Sexual Customs. Let me change this. All right. Okay, the Canaanites are known throughout the Old Testament as the major element in the population of Palestine, dispossessed by Israel in her occupation of the land flowing with milk and honey. With great indignation and broad generalization, the abominations of the Canaanites are stigmatized by Hebrew prophets, reformers, and editors of the Old Testament. They roundly condemned their people for going a whoring after the Baalim and Ashtaroth, the local manifestations of the deities of the Canaanite fertility cult, which they caricature by referring to one element in it, sexual license. So commented Professor John Gray in The Canaanites, written in 1964. This sexual license described among the Canaanites refers to the sacred sexual customs of the ancient religion, customs also found in many other areas of the Near and Middle East. During biblical times, it was still customary, as it had been for thousands of years before in Sumer, Babylon, and Canaan, for many women to live within the temple complex. In earliest times, the very core of the community. As we have seen, temples owned much of the arable land and herds of domesticated animals, kept the cultural and economic records, and generally appear to have functioned as the central controlling offices of the society. Women who resided in the sacred precincts of the divine ancestress took their lovers from among the men of the community, making love to those who came to the temple to pay honor to the goddess. Among these people, the act of sex was considered to be sacred, so holy and precious that it was enacted within the house of the creatress of heaven, earth, and all life. As one of her many aspects, the goddess was revered as the patron deity of sexual love. If you want to learn more about that, check out my video on sexual immorality. So, some archaeologists assume that these sexual customs of the temples, so repeatedly attested to in the religion of the female deity throughout the early historic periods of the Near and Middle East, must have been viewed as a type of primitive symbolic magic to invoke fertility in cattle and vegetation as well as in humans. It is my opinion that they may have developed as a result of the earliest consciousness and comprehension of the relationship of sex to reproduction. Since this connection was probably initially observed by women, it may have been integrated into the religious structure as a means of ensuring procreation among the women who chose to live and raise children within the shrine complex, as well, possibly as a method of regulating pregnancies. The concept of reproduction was pictorially explained in a gray stone plaque discovered in the Neolithic shrine of the goddess at Catalhoyuk, carved there some 8,000 years ago. One side of the relief depicts the bodies of two lovers in a close embrace, the other side, a woman holding an infant. People today, raised and programmed on the morality of the contemporary male religions, may find the ancient sexual attitudes and customs disturbing, shocking, or even sacrilegious. Yet we should consider the likelihood that such judgments or reactions are the result of the teaching and conditioning of religious attitudes present in our society, which are themselves based on the ideologies of those who initially and repetitively condemned the sexual customs of the goddess. In the worship of the female deity, sex was her gift to humanity. It was sacred and holy. She was the goddess of sexual love and procreation. But in the religions of today, we find an almost totally reversed attitude. Sex, especially non-marital sex, is considered to be somewhat naughty, dirty, even sinful. Yet, rather than calling the earliest religions which embraced such an open acceptance of all human sexuality or fertility cults, we might consider the religions of today as strange in that they seem to associate shame and even sin with the very process of conceiving new human life. Perhaps centuries from now, scholars and historians will be classifying them as sterility cults. Documentary evidence from Sumer, Babylon, Canaan, Anatolia, Cyprus, Greece, and even the Bible reveals that despite the fact that the concept of marriage was known in the earliest written records, married women, as well as single, continued to live for periods of time within the temple complex and to follow the ancient sexual customs of the goddess. The Bible itself reveals that these women were free to come and go as they pleased. Women of wealthy and royal families, as well as women of the community, participated in the sexual customs of the goddess. These women were free to marry at any time, and Strabo tells us that even as late as the 1st century BC, they were considered to be exceptionally good wives. In earliest historic times, never was the question or even the concept of respectability or propriety raised. It was later invented as the new morality. The Mediterranean Old World religions, all save the Hebraic, agreed in regarding the processes of the propagation of life as divine, at least as something not alien and abhorrent to the Godhead. But the early Christian propagandists working here on Hebraic lines intensified the isolation of God from the simple phenomena of birth, thereby engendering at times an anti-sexual bias and preparing a discord between any possible biological view and the current religion's dogma. And modern ethical thought has not been wholly a gainer thereby. So commented historian L.R. Farnold at Oxford in 1896. He was one of the few authors of that era, and of most since that time, who managed to deal with the ancient religious attitude towards sex in an objective manner, rather than causing the black type of the page to blush beet red with embarrassment or commenting upon them with righteous indignation. In this chapter, I intend to point out and try to explain the underlying reasons for this anti sexual stance of the Hebrews and subsequently the Christian religions and the confrontations that ensued. This anti sexual attitude was not the result of a more inherent purity or lesser sex drive among the adherents of the Judeo Christian beliefs. As we shall see, it was probably developed and propagated for purely political motives, aiming at goals that would allow the invading patrilineal Hebrews greater access to land and governmental control by destroying the ancient matrilineal system. From the time of the earliest Indo-European conquest, laws concerning the sacred women of the temples, the Kaddish too, laws dealing with inheritance rights, property rights, business rights, and their legal and economic relationship to their children continually appear in the codes. Yet the Indo-Europeans, as we know them, do not appear to have taken an open position against the sexual customs themselves. At least none of the literature discovered and translated up until now suggests this, though the increasingly stricter laws concerning the infidelity of married women may have been aimed at them. But among the Levite led Hebrews, we may observe the connections. The Levite laws of the Israelites from the time of Moses onward demanded virginity until marriage for all women, upon threat of death by stoning or burning, and once married, total fidelity only upon the part of the wife, also upon threat of death. Perhaps the penalty of death for a married or betrothed woman who had been raped most clearly exhibits the Levite insistence upon knowledge of paternity. Taking part in the sacred sexual customs of the temples would, of course, have broken these laws. Alongside the greater sexual restrictions for women, we find the Levite priests and prophets repeatedly condemning the sexual customs of the temple as well. I suggest that the point of the confrontation was as follows. If, as Kaddish to sacred women of the goddess, women made love to various men rather than being faithful to one husband, the children born to these women would be of questionable paternity. Sumerian and Babylonian documents reveal that these women, through their affiliations with the temple complex, owned land and other properties and engaged in extensive business activities. Various accounts report that they were often of wealthy families, well accepted in the society. Following the original kinship customs of the goddess religion, children born to Kadishtu would probably have inherited the names, titles, and property of their mothers. Matrilineal descent would have continued to exist as the inherent social structure of the community. Daughters may have been Kadishtu themselves. One inscription from Tralles in Western Anatolia, carved there as late as AD 200 by a woman named Aurelia Amelius, proudly announced that she had served in the temple by taking part in the sexual customs, as had her mother and all their female ancestors before them. The sacred sexual customs of the female religion offer us another of the apparent ties between the worship of the divine ancestress, as it was known in Sumer, Babylon, Anatolia, Greece, Carthage, Sicily, Cyprus, and even in Canaan. Women who made love in the temples were known in their own language as sacred women or the undefined. Their Akkadian name of Kadishtu is literally translated as sanctified women or holy women. Yet the sexual customs in even the most academic studies of the past 2 centuries were nearly always described as prostitution, the sacred women repeatedly referred to as temple prostitutes or ritual prostitutes. The use of the word prostitute as a translation for cottage stew not only negates the sanctity of that which was held sacred, but suggests, by the inferences and social implications of the word, an ethnocentric subjectivity on the part of the writer. It leads the reader to a misinterpretation of the religious beliefs and social structure of the period. It seems to me that the word prostitute entirely distorts the very meaning of the ancient customs which the writer is supposedly explaining. Professor Albright, who admired the lofty ideals of the Israelites, writes, sacred prostitution was apparently an almost invariable concomitant of the cult of the Phoenician and Syrian goddess. Whatever her personal name, as we know from many allusions in classical literature, especially in Herodotus, Strabo, and Lucian, as sacred prostitute the goddess was, strangely enough, from our point of view, called the Holy One. The practice was firmly implanted among the Canaanite aborigines or of Palestine and was constantly being reintroduced from the countries which surrounded Israel as a very sacred custom. To quote the words of Lucian in discussing the same practice of Hierapolis in Syria about 1,000 years after Asa. Professor James, somewhat less antagonistic, writes, This is borne out by the practice of ritual prostitution in connection with Israelite shrines at Shiloh, condemned by Amos. As Hosea makes it abundantly clear, these priestesses continued to exercise their functions with undiminished zeal in his day, 750 to 735 BC, in spite of the efforts of Amos and other reformers like Asa to eliminate them. Even in the Hebrew land of Judah, yet despite the contemporary portrayals of the sexual customs, archaeologists have found accounts of the sacred women in the earliest records of Sumer. The legend of Inanna and Enki listed the sacred sexual customs as another of the great gifts that Inanna brought to civilize the people of Erech. The Queen of Heaven was most reverently esteemed by the sacred women, who in turn were especially protected by her. At Erech, the women of the temple were known as Nugig, the pure or spotless. One interesting Sumerian fragment recorded the name of Lilith, described as a young maiden, as the hand of Inanna. We read on this ancient tablet that Lilith was sent by Inanna to gather men from the street to bring them to the temple. This same name, Lilith, later appeared in Hebrew mythology as the first wife of Adam, who refused to be sexually submissive to him, and later as the name of the demon who hovered about, waiting to find spilled sperm, of which to make her illegitimate demon children. Both these tales may well have developed in reaction to the original Lilith, so closely associated with the sexual customs of the worship of the goddess. In the 18th century BC in Babylonia, the Akkadian name of Ishtar began to replace the Sumerian name Inanna. One tablet referred to Erech, where Ishtar's worship eventually superseded that of Inanna as the city of courtesans and prostitutes. A contemporary translation of the words. This same tablet mentioned priestesses who made love with strangers, claiming that they were incarnations of the Holy Spirit. The women of Ishtar, who also known by the Akkadian word Kadishtu, while at the important temple in Babylon, they were known as Ishtaritu, which simply means women of Ishtar. Remnants of these earlier sexual customs were described by Herodotus, who reported that in his era, about 450 BC, women of Babylon made love to a stranger only once in their life as their initial sexual experience, later marrying and having sex only with their husbands from that time on. Weird. Strabo, born in Anatolia shortly before the birth of Christ, recorded that the sexual customs were followed in the worship of the goddess in many areas of Anatolia at that time. These were in the names of either Sibyl or Anatis. He reported that these customs were an integral aspect of the worship of Comana and in Lydia as well, which the inscription from Tralles, Lydia certainly supports. He wrote that in his travels, he had witnessed that the children who were born in this way were considered to be legitimate and respectable, and simply given the name and social status of the mother. He added that the name and title were then proudly used in all official inscriptions, and commented that in Anatolia of his period, the unmarried mother seems to be worshipped. Sacred women served at the temple of Aphrodite in Corinth during the classical period of Greece. Lucian later spoke of the customs in his day, AD 150. He explained that women of that time took strangers as lovers only on the feast day of Adonis. Even when the worship of the Egyptian Isis was brought into Rome, sacred women followed the ancient sexual customs there at the temple of Isis. There are no records known at this time that suggest that the women of ancient Egypt followed the sexual customs, but in chapter 23 of the book of the reformer priest Ezekiel, he angrily accused a group of Hebrew women of debauchery and lewdness, insisting that they had learned their evil sexual ways from the Egyptians. In one passage, he warned, "I will put an end to your lewdness and harlotry brought from the land of Egypt," Ezekiel 23:27. In his allegorical tale of the two young girls who symbolize the two separate nations of the Hebrew people, Judah and Israel, he complained that the girls, because they had been so sexually free in Egypt, were now evil and fallen women in Canaan. The worship of the goddess as Ashtoreth or Astarte was widespread throughout the Mediterranean area. Canaanites from Tyre and Sidon, Phoenicians, founded temples of Ashtoreth at Carthage, Eryx in Sicily, and at several sites on Cyprus. At each of these places, the sacred sexual customs were followed. Sozomenos reported the sexual customs of the temples of Ashtaroth at Athaka and Baalbek in the area now known as Lebanon. Arnold explained many of the connections in the Mediterranean area. In the religion of Ashtoreth, just as in the worship of the goddess elsewhere in the Near and Middle East, women continued to follow the sacred sexual customs. The Bible relates that Kadishtu in Jerusalem wove veils or cloths for the Asherim, images of the goddess Asherah, in what Roland DeVoe referred to as House of the Sacred Prostitutes. He too asserted that the sexual customs were quite typical of Canaanite temples and that the women of Israel followed this practice despite the condemnation of Hebrew leaders. Most vital in achieving a total comprehension of the antagonism of the Hebrews toward this custom is the realization that the sacred women continued to serve the female divinity in the ancient sexual ways. Even in the Hebrew land of Judah, the sexual customs had remained as an aspect of the religious worship at the temple in Jerusalem. The temple that had been claimed for Yahweh, the same temple where the women had been seen weeping for Tammuz. Professor James and several other scholars wrote of the worship of Ashtoreth existing side by side with that of Yahweh in Jerusalem. James also described the sexual customs in Jerusalem and at the Hebrew temple at Shiloh. In the Old Testament book of Hosea, we learn that a woman, in this case Gomer, Hosea's wife, was free to marry, raise children, and continue to make love to other men at the temple, dressing in all her finery to do so. Even in these biblical accounts, which were obviously written to demean and debase her actions, the description revealed that she took part in the sexual customs of her own free will and that she viewed them not as an obligatory or compulsory duty, but as pleasant occasions, rather like festive parties. This situation was clearly unacceptable to the men who espoused the patrilineal Hebrew system, as Hosea did, but it does reveal that those who belong to other religious systems, it was quite typical behavior. For thousands of years, these sexual customs had been accepted as natural among the people of the Near and Middle East. They may have permitted and even encouraged matrilineal descent patterns to continue and a female kinship system to survive. Inherent within the very practice of the sexual customs was the lack of concern for the paternity of children. And it is only with a certain knowledge of paternity that a patrilineal system can be maintained. I suggest that it was upon the attempt to establish this certain knowledge of paternity, which would then make patrilineal reckoning possible, that these ancient sexual customs were finally denounced as wicked and depraved, and that it was for this reason that the Levite priest devised this concept of sexual morality. Premarital virginity for women, marital fidelity for women, in other words, total control over the knowledge of paternity. Where you stand obviously determines what you see. From the point of view of those who followed the religion of the goddess, they were simply carrying out the ancient ways. From the point of view of the invading Hebrew tribes, this older religion was now to be regarded as an orgiastic, evil, lustful, shameful, disgraceful, sinful, base fertility cult. But may we suspect that underlying this moral stance with the political maneuvering for power over land and property accessible to them only upon the institution of a patrilineal system, perhaps a system long known to them in the northern lands of the Indo-Europeans? Was it perhaps for these reasons that the Levite laws declared that any sexual activities of women that did not take place within the confines of the marriage bed were to be considered as sinful, i.e., against the decrees of Yahweh? According to the according to the Bible, these laws were first instituted at the time of Moses, shortly before the Hebrews tribes invaded Canaan. The territorial and social confrontations took place side by side. It was a long and ugly battle, starting with the arrival of the Hebrews in Canaan and continuing well into the Roman and early Christian eras, much of it recorded in the Bible. To fully comprehend the extent of the anti sexual stance of the Hebrews and the attempt of the Levite priests to change the sexual behavior and attitudes of the Hebrew women, we should examine to what extent the religion of the goddess directly affected the Hebrew people. Were the customs of the goddess religion a rare diversion encountered upon aperiodic occasions, or was the religion, despite the inroads of the Indo-Europeans and Levites, still a major factor in the life of those who lived in Canaan? One cast of Upper Paleolithic Venus figure about 25,000 BC from Willendorf, Austria. This is one of numerous similar figures discovered in the Gravettian Rignatian sites that range across Europe and Asia from Spain to Russia, courtesy of the Department of Archaeology, University of Cambridge. One of several small clay goddess figures with reptile heads discovered in the city of Ur in Sumer, Iraq. Archaeologists date these figures to between 4000 and 3500 BC, courtesy of the trustees of the British Museum. Small bronze statue of the goddess astride two lions. This double lion symbolism was, in Greek and Roman periods, associated with the goddess as Artemis, Cybele, and Rhea. This figure was discovered in southern Italy and is dated to about the 5th century BC, courtesy of the trustees of the British Museum. God is seated upon double feline throne discovered in level 2, 5750 BC of Catalhoyuk, Anatolia, Turkey by James Millart, who unearthed many other goddess figures and ancient shrines at the same site, courtesy of the Museum of Archaeology in Ankara. still known to the Cretans as the little goddess of the serpents. This portrait of the goddess or one of her priestesses was discovered in the palace of Knossos on Crete. The figure is dated to the Middle Minoan period, 2000 through 1800 BC, courtesy of the Stylianos Alexou, director of the Archaeological Museum of Crete in Iraklion. A and B, two gold serpents coil about the arms and extend from the hands of this delicately carved ivory and gold goddess or priestess from the 17th century BC. Crete, courtesy Museum of Fine Arts, Boston. One of the many portrayals of the Sumerian goddess seated upon her throne. This piece was found in the level of the early dynastic period, early third millennium of the city of in Sumer, Iraq, courtesy of the trustees of the British Museum. Serpents and flowers held in her extended arms. The goddess on this plaque combines the symbolism of the Egyptian goddess Hathor and the Canaanite goddess Ashtoreth. Similar Astarte plaques have been discovered in Egypt, Lebanon, Israel, Jordan, and Iraq. This one from Egypt is dated at about 1250 BC, courtesy of the trustees of the British Museum. Small clay sculpture of a couple lying on a woven bed, perhaps depicting the ancient sacred sexual rituals of the goddess religion, one of many similar pieces from the old Babylonian period, 1900 to 1700 BC, found in the city of in Sumer or Iraq. Limestone statue of the cobra goddess Azit, named Buto by the Greeks, patron deity of all of Lower Egypt in pre-dynastic periods, protecting deity of the crown of the north in early dynastic times. Her central shrine was in Per Uto or Buto on the delta. This 7th century BC statue is from Desik, Egypt, which is believed to be the site of ancient Buto, courtesy of the University Museum of the University of Pennsylvania. This one is a gold pectoral of the winged Isis wearing the Egyptian symbol of the throne upon her head. Discovered in a pyramid in Ethiopia, this piece is dated at about 600 BC, courtesy Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. Greek period statue of the Lady of Byblos or Baalat from Byblos, Canaan or Lebanon. The worship of the goddess at the Temple of Byblos dates back to at least 2800 BC and was closely associated with the worship of Isis and Hathor of Egypt, as well as that of the Serpent Lady of the Sinai Peninsula, courtesy of the trustees of the British Museum. The protective wings of the goddess Isis shield the smaller figure of Osiris, her brother and husband. This stone carving from Egypt is dated at about 600 BC, courtesy of the trustees of the British Museum. A snake tube discovered in Beth Shan, Israel or Canaan, dated to about the 13th century BC. It is similar to the snake tubes unearthed at Kichion, Cyprus, and at Knossos, Crete, that from that same period, courtesy of the University Museum of the University of Pennsylvania. Ritual symbol in hand, Aphrodite, as she was known in Thapsus, Carthage, during the Roman period. Though generally designated as the goddess of love, Aphrodite was also revered as a battle goddess and mother of all deities. Statue of a priestess from the Aphrodite temple at Paphos, Cyprus. According to Greek legend, Cyprus, where the worship of the goddess as Ashtoreth, Astarte, had been widespread since the second millennium BC, was the site of the birth of the goddess known as Aphrodite in classical Greece. This statue is dated at about 700 BC, courtesy of the trustees of the British Museum. A larger than life size statue of the Greek goddess Demeter, worshipped as the provider of law and agriculture, whose most important center was at Eleusis. This portrayal of the goddess of the Eleusinian mysteries comes from Cnidus, Turkey, or ancient Caria, courtesy of the trustees of the British Museum. Seal stone of the goddess Athena, whose major site of worship was the Acropolis of Athens, Greece. As in many other portrayals of Athena, she is depicted here with her sacred serpent. This small carving in carnelian was found in Curium, Cyprus, and is dated to the 5th century BC, courtesy of the trustees of the British Museum. Large bronze head of Athena in her battle helmet. Serpents adorn her shoulders and breastplate. Found in Piraeus, Greece, this portrayal of the patron deity of Athens is dated to the 4th century BC. Amazons, fact or fantasy? Greek and Roman records report that the Amazons worshiped the goddess as the mother of all deities. This is one section of a massive relief depicting the Amazons on the tomb of Artemisia in Halicarnassus, Turkey, or ancient Caria. The monument is one of the numerous portrayals of Amazon women battling against Greek men, courtesy of the trustees of the British Museum. This votive relief, dedicated to the goddess Artemis, portrays the presentation to the goddess of the torch passed in a race run in her honor at Piraeus, Greece. It is dated to the 4th century BC, courtesy of the trustees of the British Museum. They offered incense to the Queen of Heaven. Though buried deep beneath the sands of what was Canaan, statues of the female deity have been continually unearthed in archaeological excavations. These images of the goddess, some dating back as far as 7000 BC, offer silent testimony to the most ancient worship of the Queen of Heaven in the land that is today most often remembered as the birthplace of both Judaism and Christianity. Yigal Yadin, professor of archaeology at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem and director of the Institute of Archaeology there, recently published his account of the excavation of the city of Hazor in biblical Canaan. Somewhat evasively, he describes the evidence of the worship of the goddess there in this way. Although the official religion of northern Israel was that of Yahweh, the God of Israel, we know from both biblical verses and archaeological discoveries that the cult of Baal and Astarte strongly influenced the local population in the form of folk or popular beliefs. For double insurance, as it were, indeed, we discovered quite a number of clay figurines representing Astarte, the fertility goddess, and of what may be called the holy prostitutes connected with the Baal and Astarte cult. Discussing the late Bronze Age in Canaan, about 1500 through 1300 BC, Professor Albright tells us that one of the most commonest classes of religious objects found in late bronze levels is constituted by the so-called Astarte plaques. These are pottery plaques, generally oval in shape, on which were impressed from a pottery or metal mold a figure of the nude goddess Asherah in face with her arms upraised, grasping lily stalks or serpents or both in her hands. The goddess's head is adorned with two long spiral ringlets, identical with the Egyptian Hathor ringlets. These plaques were borrowed from Mesopotamia, where they have a long prehistory in the early Bronze Age, about 3200 through 2100 BC. Kathleen Kenyon, former director of the British School of Archaeology at Jerusalem, discussing biblical Canaan, writes of the Astarte plaques, which are the most common cult object on almost all sites of the period, late Bronze Age, that such plaques, with their association with Phoenician religion, are found cannot, however, be taken on any particular site as evidence that it had not yet come under Israelite control. For Tel Beit Mersum itself provides clear evidence for the occurrence of such plaques or similar figurines right down to the 7th century BC. The denunciations by the prophets are enough to show that Yahwehism had continuously to struggle with the ancient religion of the land. In exploring the influence and importance of the worship of the goddess in Canaan in biblical times, we find that as Ashtoreth, Asherah, Astarte, Ataret, Anath, or simply Elat or Baalat, both defined as goddess, she was the principal deity of such great Canaanite cities as Tyre, Sidon, Ashelon, Bethanath, Aphakah, Byblos, and Ashtoreth Karnaim. In 1894, Robertson Smith conjectured that Astarte had already become the less important wife of Baal by biblical times. Yet we read inscriptions to the goddess in Canaan as celestial ruler, mistress of kingship, mother of all deities. She is certainly associated with Baal or mini Baalim, but upon careful observation, we find that the ritual and form of the religious practices are those of the ancient goddess religion. According to Seton Lloyd, professor of Western Asiatic archaeology, the word Baal, which is usually translated as Lord, originally implied a temporary position or temporary ownership of property. It may have been used much like the Indo-European word patai, also used as Lord, owner, master, and husband. And as I mentioned before, may even be related to the Sanskrit word Bala. In the legends of Ugarit in northern Canaan, Baal of Mount Saphon asked the goddess, known there as Anath, to help secure a temple for him when he had none. In these same legends of the 14th century BC, Anath easily slew the enemy who had been powerful enough to first frighten and then murder Baal. Though the name Baal may have been introduced centuries earlier as the storm god of Mount Saphon by the Hurrians in Ugarit, by the time of the writing of these legends, the name was also identified with the consort of the goddess, and in Ugarit, Baal held the dual role as storm god of the mountain and the dying consort, much like Dumuzi, Tammuz, Attis, Osiris, and Adonis. Upon his death, we are told Anath's grief for him was like that of a cow for her calf. Even Thor-El, an older male deity described by some writers as the head of the deities at Ugarit, was recorded to have hidden in the innermost sanctuary of his 8 chambers, trembling in fear at the approach of the mighty Anath. In these same texts, Anath was known as mistress of kingship, mistress of dominion, mistress of the high heavens. In light of the tablets of northern Canaan, one can hardly defend the idea that either of these male deities was portrayed as all-powerful or omnipotent, unless one simply insists upon assuming that all male deities always were. Though this conclusion is left unspoken by most writers, it is the goddess Anath who emerges from these Canaanite legends as the deity of greatest valor and strength. In his Dictionary of the Bible of 1900, J. Hastings asserted that Ashtoreth was supreme, saying of her, "This goddess was the chief divinity of the Semites in their primitive matriarchal stage of organization. She was the analog of the human matriarch, free in her love, the fruitful mother of the clan, and its leader in peace and war." In the pages of the Old Testament, however, Ashtaroth, the name used most often in southern Canaan, where most of the Hebrew people had settled, seldom appears alone. Her name was nearly always joined with Baal, much as many of the serpent demons of the Indo-European legends were the sons or husbands of the goddess. At times, the religion is even designated as Baalism. Though it is certainly possible that the Canaanite religion in the south, where Aryan princes had by now made deep inroads, may have elevated Baal to a higher status by later biblical times. The worship, the rituals, the sexual customs, the eunuch priest, the grieving for Tammuz or Baal as the dying consort, the abundance of the Astarte statues and plaques, the symbolic pillars and poles, actually called Asherah, though always in lowercase, all reveal that it was the symbolism and customs of the religion of the goddess that were actually the target of Hebrew aggression. It appears more than likely that the Levite priests, just as they purposely misspelled and mispronounced her name, reciting it as Boseth, meaning shame, and referring to her only in the masculine gender, refers refused to even recognize the position of the goddess, doing this by continually linking her name with that of her male consort. As we read before, the Bible and other religious literature may well be partially the result of intentional political aims as much as a record of some long-standing belief or lore. In discussing the paradise myth of the Bible, Joseph Campbell wrote of conspicuously contrived counterfeit mythologies. Professor Shearer wrote that the Marduk myth was probably propagated with the help of the Babylonian armies, and pointed out that the Asher legend of the supremacy was simply a reworked version of the Marduk myth. He also wrote that the myth of Adam and Eve had been evidently produced in scholarly circles, and further explained that the Bible was subject to the censorship of priests who had the power of decision over what was fit to be incorporated into the history of the founders of the race. Professor Windengren also commented that the Bible as we know it has in many passages quite obviously been exposed to censorship and correspondingly purged. Though many accounts of the Bible are probably based on actual historical events, confirmed in various ways by documents and evidence produced by archaeological excavation, it seems quite likely that the biblical Levite reports of the pagan religion in Canaan were presented from the point of view that was most advantageous and acceptable to the Levite theology, rather than as a totally objective historical record. Despite the various methods used to confuse the identity and gender of the goddess as Ashtaroth or Asherah, even in the Bible as we know it today, passages and symbolism betray the influential and prevailing presence of the ancient worship of the female deity, while other Canaanite and Near Eastern artifacts confirm it. In Egypt, the Hebrews had known the worship of the goddess as Isis or Hathor. For 4 generations, they had been living in a land where women held a very high status, and the matrilineal descent system continued to function at most periods. Judging from the numbers of the Hebrews who emerged from Egypt, as compared with the family of the 12 sons who supposedly entered it 4 generations earlier, it seems likely that a great number of those Hebrew people known as Israelites may actually have been Egyptians, Canaanites, Semitic nomads, and other goddess worshiping people who had joined together in Egypt. Just to the east of Canaan and Babylon stood the temples of Ishtar. And in the land of Canaan, the land that the Hebrews invaded and made their own after their departure from Egypt, archaeological records and artifacts reveal that the religion of the goddess as Ashtoreth, Astarte, Asherah, Anat, Alat, or Baalat still flourished in many of the great cities. You shall destroy their altars, break their images. The Levite writers of the Old Testament claimed that their deity had presented them with the land of Canaan as the promised land. Yet it is clear, even in their own accounts, that Canaan was not an empty land. Even in the time of Abraham, in Numbers 13, 17 through 19, it was recorded that upon the arrival of the Hebrew tribes, as they approached from the deserts of Sinai, they sent an advance envoy into the cities of Canaan. This was their report of the situation at about 1300 through 1250 BC. We went into the land to which you sent us. It does indeed flow with milk and honey. This is its produce. At the same time, its inhabitants are a very powerful people. The towns are fortified and very big. Numbers 13:28. The Bible account admits that Canaan was already inhabited and that many of the people lived in great fortified towns. Despite this, we read of the intention of the arriving Hebrews not only to continue into the land of Canaan, but to purposely and violently destroy the existing religion and replace it with their own. This intention was presented by the Levites as the command of Yahweh, supposedly ordered before the Israelites entered Canaan. Observe thou that which I command thee this day. Behold, I drive out before thee the Amorite, and the Hittite, and the Perizzite, and the Hivite, and the Jebusite. Take heed to thyself, lest thou make a covenant with the inhabitants of the land whither thou goest, lest it be for a snare in the midst of thee. But ye shall destroy their altars, break their images, and cut down their groves. For thou shalt worship no other God, for the Lord, whose name is jealous, is a jealous God. Exodus 34:11 through 16. With this order, the Hebrew invasion of Canaan began. Though the Hebrew entrance into the promised land of Canaan is often imagined to be the arrival into a haven of peace after centuries of slavery in Egypt, according to the Bible, its occupation took the form of a series of bloody sieges, perhaps much like those of the earlier Indo-European invasions. In Deuteronomy 2:33, we read that under the leadership of Moses and Aaron, the Israelites met a king named Sihon at the town of Jahaz. The Levite accounts tell us the Lord our God delivered him into our hands. We killed him with his sons and all his people. We captured all his cities at that time and put to death everyone in the cities, men, women, and dependents. We left no survivor. When they met Og, king of Bashan, we are told in Deuteronomy 3:3 through 7 that so the Lord our God also delivered Og, king of Bashan, into our hands with all his people. We slaughtered them and left no survivor. In all, we took 60 cities. Thus, we put to death all men, women, and dependents in every city. Both Aaron and Moses died in the desert. Joshua assumed command, and the Israelites entered Jericho. We learn in Joshua 6:21 that under the ban, they destroyed everything in the city. They put everyone to the sword, men and women, young and old. But in this same siege, we are told that all the silver and gold, all the vessels of copper and iron shall be holy. They belong to the Lord, and they must go into the Lord's treasury. Joshua 6:19. And in Joshua 6:24, we learn that these orders were carried out as they set fire to the city and everything in it, except that they deposited the silver and gold and the vessels of copper and iron in the treasury of the Lord's house. In the Battle of Ai, we are told the number who were killed that day, men and women, was 12,000, and the whole population of Ai, Joshua 8:25. And in Joshua 8:29, it claims that Joshua hanged the king of Ai on a tree and left him there till sunset. Since in an earlier passage, Joshua was told by Yahweh to do with the king of Ai as he had done with the king of Jericho, we may assume that this was the king of Jericho's fate as well, though the account of the event is no longer recorded. We read in Joshua 10 that Joshua captured Makkedah and put both king and people to the sword, destroying both them and every living thing in the city. He left no survivor, and he dealt with the king of Makkedah as he had dealt with the king of Jericho. Then Joshua and all the Israelites marched on from Makkedah to Libnah and attacked it. The Lord delivered its king and the city to the Israelites, and they put its people and every living thing in it to the sword. They left no survivor there and dealt with its king as they had dealt with the king of Jericho. From Libnah, Joshua and all the Israelites marched on Lachish, took up their positions, and attacked it. The Lord delivered Lachish into their hands. They took it on the second day and put every living thing in it to the sword, as they had done at Libnah. 1 second. Meanwhile, Horam, king of Gezer, had advanced to the relief of Lachish. But Joshua struck them down, both king and people, and not a man of them survived. Then Joshua and all the Israelites marched on from Lachish to Eglon, took up their positions, and attacked it. That same day they captured it and put its inhabitants to the sword, destroying every living thing in it, as they had done at Lachish. From Eglon, Joshua and all the Israelites advanced to Hebron and attacked it. That same day, they captured it and put its inhabitants to the sword, destroying every living thing in it, as they had done at Lachish. From Eglon, Joshua and all the Israelites advanced to Hebron and attacked it. They captured it and put its king to the sword, with every living thing in it and in all its villages. As at Eglon, he left no survivor, destroying it and every living thing in it. Then Joshua and all the Israelites wheeled round towards Debir and attacked it. They captured the city with its king and all its villages, put them to the sword, and destroyed every living thing. They left no survivor. They dealt with Debir and its king as they had dealt with Hebron and with Libnah and its king. So Joshua massacred the population of the whole region, the hill country, the Negev, the Shephelah, the watersheds, and all their kings. He left no survivor, destroying everything that drew breath, as the Lord God of Israel had commanded. Joshua 10:28 through 40. And that is a map of southern Canaan. In similarly described sieges, Joshua and the Israelites destroyed the cities of Gibeon, Hazor, and as far as Baal Gad in the vale of the Lebanon under Mount Hermon. At the risk of being repetitive, I cannot help thinking of Professor Albright's comment that the orgiastic nature worship of Canaan was replaced by Israel with its pastoral simplicity and purity of life, its lofty monotheism, and its severe code of ethics. Rather than the image of poor downtrodden slaves with lofty ideas entering the promised land to rest their weary bones and build a new and better life, we are more likely to be reminded of the description Professor Lloyd gave of the Luvian entrance into Anatolia and the pathway that was made as their progress was marked by signs of widespread destruction. As if in further refutation of this supposed purity of life or severe code of ethics, we read that although all the accounts state that the Israelites left no survivors, this may not have been the total truth. For in the book of Numbers 31 and 17, we read that after a battle against the Midianites, while still under the leadership of Moses and Aaron, the Israelites were told, kill every male dependent and kill every woman who has had intercourse with a man, but spare for yourselves every woman among them who has not had intercourse. In Numbers 31, 32 through 35, we read a list of the spoils and war booty taken by the Israelites at this same battle. In this order, they list sheep, cattle, asses, and 32,000 girls who had no intercourse with a man. In the book of Deuteronomy, also preceding the command of Joshua, we find, when you wage war against your enemy and the Lord your God delivers them into your hands, and you take some of them captive, then if you see a comely woman among the captives and take a liking to her, you may marry her. You shall bring her into your house, where she shall shave her head, pare her nails, and discard the clothes she had when she was captured. Then she shall stay in your house and mourn her father and mother for a full month. After that, you may have intercourse with her. You shall be her husband, and she your wife. But if you no longer find her pleasing, let her go free. You must not sell her, not treat her harshly, since you have had your will with her. Deuteronomy 21, 10 through 14. Though once again, the numbers may have been somewhat exaggerated, these passages suggest that many of the women who were later known as the wives of the Israelites may well have been the girls who witnessed the murders of all their families and friends and the destruction of their homes and towns. The combination of the fear and trauma they must have felt, having been taken into the Hebrew tribes in this way, along with their memories of their childhood customs and religions, must have made their attitude and position in Hebrew life a most difficult one. Though the number of women in the Hebrew tribes is never listed, these passages also suggest that when the Hebrews first left Egypt, there may have been a much greater percentage of men. Each of these factors may help to explain the Hebrew women's acceptance of the new patriarchal laws. And they forsook the Lord and worshipped Baal and Ashtoreth. Though according to biblical records, the entire population of many towns and cities had been massacred. Several great cities had not been touched. Cities where Ashtoreth was still worshipped with great reverence. Once in Canaan, the captured lands were divided among the tribes, the Levites to live among each of them. From this point on, we observe the lengthy and violent attack of the Hebrews launched upon the Queen of Heaven and her Baal, or her Lord. Despite all the warnings, the religion of the goddess was a great temptation to the Hebrews who had invaded Canaan. To many of them, it had been the religion of their ancestors. References to the Hebrew people worshiping in the ancient religion repeatedly appear in the pages of the Bible. Once again, the accounts of the Levite priests. Judges 2:13, and they forsook the Lord and worshipped Baal and Ashtoreth. Judges 3 and 7, and the people did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, forgetting the Lord their God, and served the Baals and the Ashtoreth. Samuel 7:3 and 4. Samuel spake unto the house of Israel, saying, if you do return unto the Lord with all your hearts, then put away the strange gods and Ashtoreth from among you, and prepare your hearts unto the Lord, and serve him only, and he will deliver you out of the hands of the Philistines. The period of Samuel took place in the time of Saul, the first Hebrew king, about 1050 BC. Judges takes place before that time. According to the Bible, King Solomon at about 960 through 922 BC worshipped Ashtoreth as well as other local deities. He was eventually threatened with the loss of his kingdom for having forsaken Yahweh and revering the Queen of Heaven, Ashtoreth of the Sidonians. In 1 Kings 15:13, we find the report of the dethroning of Queen Maacah by her son or grandson Asa at about 910 BC. The crime, worshiping Asherah. The name Asherah was also used in the text of northern Canaan at times alongside Anath. They may have been worshipped as mother and daughter at that time, but Asherah is also identified with Ashtoreth, who was deeply revered in Tyre and Sidon under that name. One text of northern Canaan describes Asherah as follows. He arrived at the shrine of Asherah of the Tyrians, of the goddess of the Sidonians. In the text of Ugarit, Asherah was known as the creator of all deities. The defection from Yahweh, as described above, continued throughout the biblical accounts, as we shall see. But a most revealing passage is in the book of Jeremiah. This incident took place in a Hebrew colony in Egypt at about 600 BC. Here, the religion of the goddess and the reverence paid to her, even by the Hebrews of that time, was described not as a new religion that they had recently adopted, but one that the Hebrews had followed before in Jerusalem. It also strongly hints that this was a religion of women, though the Levite writer carefully depicted the husbands as having authority and exhibits an obvious insistence upon male lineage in the answer given even by the worshippers of the Queen of Heaven. At this time, all the men who knew their wives offered incense to alien gods, and all the women who were standing there. A large assembly with all the people living in Pathros in the land of Egypt answered Jeremiah as follows. We have no intention listening to this word you have spoken to us in Yahweh's name, but intend to go on doing all that we have vowed to do, offering incense to the Queen of Heaven and pouring libations in her honor as we used to do, we and our fathers, our kings and our leaders in the town of Judah and in the streets of Jerusalem. We had plenty of food then. We lived well. We suffered no disasters. But since we have given up offering incense to the Queen of Heaven and pouring libations in her honor, we have been destitute and have perished, either by sword or by famine. The women added, when we offer incense to the Queen of Heaven and pour libations in her honor, do you think we make cakes for her with her features on them and pour libations to her without our husband's knowledge? Jeremiah 44:15 through 19. Professor Hook asks, what are we to say when we find in the record the gardens of Adonis, Ezekiel's chambers of imagery, women declaring that since they ceased baking cakes for the Queen of Heaven, nothing has gone well with them, the Masabath, the Asherahs, the divinations, and the numerous other practices? And answered, it is surely impossible to deny that these are foreign elements, some Canaanite, some presumably Assyro-Babylonian, and some possibly Egyptian, and that all these enter into the picture of the religion of Israel as it appears in the Old Testament. Professor Wendengren, as if in additional answer, observed, now this Queen of Heaven or Heavens cannot possibly be any other goddess than Astarte, who accordingly as late as circa 600 enjoyed official worship in the kingdom of Judah. Many Bible passages report that idols of the female deity, referred to as Asherah in lowercase, were to be found on every high hill, under every green tree, and alongside altars in the temples. They were a symbol identified with the worship of the goddess as Asherah and may have been a pole or a living tree, perhaps carved as a statue. Arthur Evans wrote that the biblical records again and again attest the cult of Asherah either as a living tree or its substitute, the dead post or pole before which the Canaanite altars were set. I suspect that the Asherim, plural, were actually fig trees, the sycamore fig, the tree that was in Egypt considered to be the body of the goddess on earth. There are many reasons to believe that this is so, evidence that we shall examine more thoroughly in unraveling the myth of Adam and Eve, evidence that perhaps explains the symbolism of the tree in the paradise myth. Continuing our exploration of the presence of the goddess in Canaan, biblical accounts tell us that the Asherim, though their association with Asherah as the goddess is never explained, were to be found everywhere. And the people of Israel did secretly against the Lord their God things that were not right. They built high places, set up pillars and asherim on every high hill and under every green tree. They served idols, made molten images of two calves. They made an Asherah and sold themselves to do evil in the sight of the Lord. 2 Kings 17:9. As the Levites declared that it was the Hebrew mission to destroy these symbols of the religion they so often refer to as their gods, wherever they were found, this is exactly what they did. The Levite priest wrote that the destruction had been commanded by Yahweh. You shall surely destroy all the places where the nations whom you shall dispossess serve their gods, upon the high mountains and upon the hills, and under every green tree. You shall tear down their pillars and burn their asherim with fire. Deuteronomy 12:2-3. You shall not plant any tree as an Asherah beside the altar of the Lord. Deuteronomy 16:21. But despite the warnings of the Levite priests, the Asherim were continually erected and worshipped. In 1 Kings 16:13, we read that at about 850 BC, the Hebrew king Ahab, husband of Jezebel, made an Asherah. Isaiah, sometime in the 8th century BC, spoke of Asherim in the city of Damascus. Gideon, in the period of Judges, destroyed the Asherah of one temple, using its wood as a burnt offering to Yahweh. It was threatened that the Lord will smite Israel because they have made their Asherim. King Hezekiah, who reigned about 715 through 690 BC, did what was right in the eyes of the Lord. He broke the pillars and cut down the Asherah. It was this same Hezekiah who destroyed a bronze serpent which had been kept at the temple in Jerusalem from the time of the arrival of the Hebrews in Canaan. After Hezekiah, his son Manasseh, who ruled for 55 years, once again erected the Asherim, as did his son Ammon, who succeeded him. In 2 Kings 23:4-15, the Levite priest Hilkiah, who served King Josiah at about 630 BC, took the vessels made for Asherah and Baal out of this same temple in Jerusalem. He removed the Asherah. He defiled the high place which Solomon had built for Ashtoreth. He broke in pieces the pillars and cut down the Asherim and filled their places with the bones of men. Though again the religion of the goddess is never mentioned, further evidence of her worship in Canaan during the late biblical times was revealed by the presence of the mourners for her son or lover Tammuz. In the book of Ezekiel, we read of the women weeping for Tammuz at this same temple in Jerusalem at about 620 BC, continuing to practice the mourning ceremonies of the religion of the goddess, known so well from the Babylonian accounts of Ishtar. As previously quoted, Professor Windengren asserted that a ritual mourning took place in Israel commemorating the death of Tammuz, just as it did in Mesopotamia. I. Epstein, in his History of Judaism, written in 1959, wrote of the influx of pagan ideas, especially at the time of Solomon, blaming Solomon's wives for his idolatrous ways. There is a strong possibility that Solomon's habit of collecting foreign princesses for his harem, 700 of them according to the Bible, may have been a politically motivated system of securing the ultimate right to rule over the conquered lands by marrying their heiresses. The relationship of the rights to many a throne in the Near East to the matrilineal descent pattern of the goddess worshipping people may explain the great number of royal foreign women, all listed as legal wives of Solomon, and the accepted presence of the religions which they brought with them. After Solomon's reign, when the Hebrew tribes divided into two separate nations, the worship of the goddess continually appeared. This is evident in Samaria, the capital of the northern kingdom, Israel, during the period of Ahab and Jezebel, about 869 through 850 BC. The worship of Ashtoreth and her Baal was apparently flourishing there at that time. The marriage of the Hebrew Ahab to Jezebel, the daughter of the queen and king of Sidon, who also served as high priestess and priest to Ashtoreth and Baal, may also have brought to him a more legitimate right to the throne. But even King Jeroboam, before that time, about 922 through 901 BC, had made golden calves symbols of the goddess religion. In Judah, the southern Hebrew kingdom, whose capital was Jerusalem, Rehoboam at about 922 through 915 BC, and his son Abijam, both perhaps reigning as husbands of Queen Maacah, were said to have practiced pagan idolatries. As we know, Queen Maacah worshipped Asherah and was eventually dethroned for having made an idol of her. At about 842 BC, Queen Athaliah ruled in Jerusalem, and with her reign, the pagan religion continued to flourish. As Jezebel's daughter, we may once again question if, in the eyes of many of the people of Canaan, Athaliah held the right to rule as the granddaughter of the high priestess and priest of Ashtaroth and Sidon. At about 735 through 727 BC, King Ahaz also followed the ancient religion, committing evil in the eyes of the Lord. At about 620 BC, the women of Ezekiel's time were seen weeping for Tammuz at the temple in Jerusalem, while in Jeremiah's day, about 600 BC, rebellious women openly announced their intention of continuing to revere the Queen of Heaven. Summary. As a result of archaeological evidence, which helps to explain many of the obscure references, despite the evasive wording and lack of explanation in the Bible, there is no question that in biblical periods of Canaan and Levite priests of the Hebrews were in continual contact with the religion of the goddess. Though the commanded destruction of artifacts has probably resulted in fewer archaeological finds in southern Canaan than the rest of the Near East, masses of evidence of the extensive worship of the goddess have been unearthed in all the other lands in which the Hebrews either lived or were in close contact, lands such as Egypt, Babylon, Sinai, and northern Canaan. Surrounding the Hebrews in northern Canaan were the original inhabitants of Canaan, people who lived in the cities that had not been destroyed and who had revered the female divinity from the most ancient times. As revealed by the Bible itself, the adoration of the goddess, even in the Hebrew capitals of Samaria and Jerusalem, even by those who were considered to be members of the tribes that followed the new religion of Yahweh, most especially their royalty and rulers, who do not seem to have been chosen from the Levite tribe, appears to be one of the major influential factors in the development of the Judaic and later the Christian attitudes. The possibility that the Levites may originally have been related to the Indo-European Luvians, while the other tribes may have been descendants of the Mediterranean goddess-worshiping peoples, may help to explain this division between the Levite priests and prophets and the continual waywardness and defection of the Israelite people, who appear to have drifted toward the ancient religion time and time again. The Levite priests declared, "There shall be no cult prostitutes of the daughters of Israel." Yet, as we have already seen, the ancient sexual customs continued. It seems to have been the very nature of the sexual customs, so inherent and integral a part of the female religion, allowing for and possibly encouraging matrilineal descent patterns to continue, that aroused the most violent reactions among the Levite patrilinealists. Once aware of the continual presence of the goddess religion, a careful reading of the accounts in the Old Testament in which the Hebrew woman was initially assigned to the secondary status of obedient assistant reveals extensive passages spent in continuous threat, at times in veiled or hidden in symbolism, against the worship of the goddess. But some of the threats were more open. They were aimed at those who continued to practice the ancient religion, revealing, even within the records of the Bible, accounts of slaughter and massacre of those who dared to pray to other gods. As we shall see in the following chapter, the insistent and repetitious sexual imagery allows us to observe the Levite attitudes toward the sexual customs of the goddess religion and the sexual autonomy of women generally. Autonomy that had for thousands of years helped to allow women to retain their independence economically, socially, and legally. Thus, into the laws of the Levites was written the destruction of the worship of the divine ancestress, and with it the final destruction of the matrilineal system. Chapter 9. And the men of the city shall stone her with stones. So antagonistic were the Levite priests toward the religion of the goddess in Canaan, though the term other gods is evasively used in each passage, that laws were written prohibiting the worship of these other gods. The laws were so severe that they commanded the members of the Hebrew religion to murder even their own children if they did not worship Yahweh. The Levite laws of the Bible ordered, if your brother or son or daughter or wife or friend suggests serving other gods, you must kill them. Your hand must be the first raised in putting him to death, and all the people shall follow you. Deuteronomy 13:6. This order was obviously directed only toward men, for the one relative it did not suggest killing was the husband. Not only relatives were to be kept under watchful surveillance, for the Levites also wrote, if the inhabitants of a town that once served the Lord your God now serve other gods, you must kill all the inhabitants of that town. Deuteronomy 13:15. Once aware of the identity of the Queen of Heaven and the extent of her worship as it existed in Canaan, even among the Hebrew royalty, we may gain a deeper insight into the political motivations of the Levites by becoming more familiar with the imagery of women in the Bible and the specific laws concerning them. The Hebrew prophets and priests, the Levites, wrote with open and scornful contempt of any woman who was neither virgin nor married. They insisted that all women must be publicly designated as the private property of some man, father, or husband. Thus, they developed and instituted the concept of sexual morality for women. In a foreword written by Bible historian I. Epstein in 1935, which prefaces a version of the Hebrew Talmud, he suggests that this was the major reason for the Hebrews being so threatened by the surrounding religions. Experience soon proved how great was the temptation to imitate the religious practices of surrounding nations, even at a time when the Israelites inhabited a land of their own. The difficulty of resisting alien influence grew much more severe in periods of dispersion when Jews were living in a heathen environment and the rabbis had to give serious attention to the problem of how to counteract the forces of assimilation which threatened to submerge the Jewish communities settled in countries where idol worship was the state religion. It is important to understand that the vehement opposition to idolatry, which distinguishes the legislation of the Bible and later of the Talmud, was not merely the antagonism of one theological system to another. Fundamentally, it was a conflict of ethical standards. Heathen people practiced abominations against which the scriptures earnestly warned Israel. Idolatry was identified with immoral conduct, an identification which was too often verified by experience. This conflict of ethical standards and immoral conduct appears to be primarily the Levite perception of the sexual customs, known to have existed at all periods of biblical history. The lack of concern for the paternity of children among the Hebrew people who continued to revere the Queen of Heaven, thus allowing matrilineal descent patterns to continue as a result of the sexual customs, appears to have been the crux of the persecution of the ancient beliefs by the priests of the Hebrew tribes. It was surely apparent to Levite leaders that if a religion existed alongside their own, a religion in which women owned their own property, were endowed with a legal identity, and were free to relate sexually to various men, it would be much more difficult for the Hebrew men to convince their women that they must accept the position of being their husband's property. Hebrew women had to be taught to accept the idea that for a woman to sleep with more than one man was evil. They had to be taught that it would bring disaster, wrath, and shame from the Almighty, while it was simultaneously acceptable for their husbands to have sexual relationships with 2, 3, or 50 women. Thus, premarital virginity and marital fidelity were proclaimed by Levite law as divinely essential for all Hebrew women. The antithesis of the attitudes toward female sexuality held in the religion of the goddess. Yet, the influence and prestige of the ancient religion was ever present. As we have seen, there are continual biblical reports of paganism in every era. It loomed as a constant problem described throughout the Old Testament. The prophet priest of Yahweh threatened. They scolded. The Levite writers labeled any sexually autonomous women, including the sacred women of the temple, as whores and harlots, and demanded the enforcement of their own patriarchal attitudes concerning the sexual ownership of women. Once having invented this concept of morality, they flung accusations of immorality at the women whose behavior and lives, in accordance with their own most ancient beliefs, were of the highest and most sacred nature. But thou hast played the harlot with many lovers. Most revealing was the symbolic analogy they drew between any women who refused to abide by the laws of the new morality continually referred to as harlots and adulteresses, and the waywardness and defection of the entire Hebrew people in their constant lack of fidelity to Yahweh. The use of female sexual infidelity as the ultimate sin, so serious that it was regarded as analogous to the betrayal of Yahweh, affords us some insight into the Levite attitude toward the sexually autonomous woman. The two parts of the analogy are often tightly intertwined, sometimes in a rather obscure fashion, but as the prophets of Yahweh railed at the Hebrews who dared to worship other gods, the attack upon any woman who refused to be the property of a specific man was made simultaneously and automatically. As we have seen, despite the constant threats, Hebrew women and men alike, even their royalty, did indeed continue to worship the Queen of Heaven. In doing this, they were symbolized by the priest as the daughter of Zion, and as this daughter denounced as an unfaithful harlot. Jeremiah, Isaiah, Ezekiel, Hosea, and Nahum all used the sexual metaphor extensively. Jeremiah, a Levite priest, put it this way: they say, if a man put away his wife and she goes from him and becomes another man's, shall he return to her again? Shall not that land be greatly polluted? But thou hast played the harlot with many lovers. Yet return again to me, saith the Lord. In another passage, he again compared the defection of the Hebrews to an unfaithful woman, saying, surely as a wife treacherously departeth from her husband, so have ye dealt treacherously with me, O house of Israel, saith the Lord. In yet another tirade, he accused the Hebrews of playing the harlot on every high mountain or under every green tree. Angrily he spoke as Yahweh, asking, how can I forgive you for all this? Your sons have forsaken me and sworn by gods that are no gods. I gave them all they needed, yet they preferred adultery and haunted the brothels. Jeremiah 5:7. And once again, the analogy was used as in Jeremiah 3:6-10, we read, in the reign of King Josiah, the Lord said to me, do you see what apostate Israel did? She went up to every hilltop and under every spreading tree, and there she played the whore. Even after she had done all this, I said to her, come back to me, but she would not. That faithless woman, her sister Judah, saw it all. She saw too that I had put apostate Israel away and given her a note of divorce because she had committed adultery. Yet that faithless woman, her sister Judah, was not afraid. She too has gone and played the whore. She defiled the land with her thoughtless harlotry and her adulterous worship of stone and wood. Jeremiah's words were spoken about a century after the defeat of the northern kingdom, Israel, by Sargon II of Assyria in 722 BC. The Levite priest prophet Ezekiel told his congregation, the word of the Lord came to me. Man, he said, there were once two women, daughters of the same mother. They played the whore in Egypt, played the whore while they were still girls. For there they let their breasts be fondled and their virgin bosoms pressed. The elder was named Oholah, her sister Oholibah. They became mine and bore me sons and daughters. Aholah is Samaria, Oholibah is Jerusalem. The entire section of Ezekiel 23 describes the lewd sexual behavior of these two sisters, symbolizing the two Hebrew capitals, during which Ezekiel says, so I will put a stop to your lewdness and the way in which you learnt to play the whore in Egypt. He finally summarizes with, thus I will put an end to the lewdness in the land, and other women shall be taught not to be as lewd as they. You shall pay the penalty for your lewd conduct and shall be punished for your idolatries, and you will know that I am the Lord God. In still another passage, Ezekiel warned, and they shall burn thy houses with fire and execute judgments upon thee to cease from playing the harlot, and thou shalt give no hire any more. Nahum, speaking of the city of Nineveh, a religious center of the Babylonian goddess Ishtar, struck out against the goddess and her sexuality in this way. Because of the multitudes of the whoredom of the well-favored harlot, the mistress of witchcrafts, that selleth nations through her whoredoms and families through her witchcrafts, behold, I am against thee, saith the Lord of hosts, and I will discover thy skirts upon thy face, and I will show the nations thy nakedness, and the kingdoms thy shame. But the first few sections of the book of Hosea most clearly depict the outrage of the Hebrew man with the wife who refused to be his private property. First, we read that Yahweh told Hosea, take yourself a wife of harlotry and have children of harlotry, for the land commits great harlotry by forsaking the Lord. Hosea then spoke to his daughter of the whoredom and lewdness of her mother Gomer, who was apparently a sacred woman of the temple. Later, Gomer was told to put away her harlotry and adultery, to which she defiantly replied, I will go after my lovers. In response to this rebellion, the male deity threatened to thwart her activities until such time as she would finally say, in desperation, I will go and return to my first husband. It is not clear whether these were intended to be the words of Hosea or Yahweh, for they are initially presented as the words of Hosea to his wife, but we read, I will put an end to all her rejoicing, her feasts, her new moons, her Sabbaths, and all her solemn festivals. I mean to make her pay for all the days when she offered burnt offerings to the Baals and decked herself with rings and necklaces to court her lovers, forgetting me. It is Yahweh who is speaking. Hosea then goes on to say, your daughters play the harlot, and your brides commit adultery, for the men go aside with harlots and sacrifice with cult prostitutes. And they went forth and they slew in the city. Not only were those women insulted, but violent threats were also made. In the book of Jeremiah, that prophet angrily threatened the daughter of Egypt, Tyre, Sidon, and Ashkelon, a symbolic reference, judging by the cities mentioned, to the goddess. In another passage, he warned the women who openly announced their intention to continue their worship of the Queen of Heaven that they would meet with famine, violence, and total destruction as a result of their religious beliefs. The prophet Isaiah, distraught with the situation, moaned, as for my people, children are their oppressors and women rule over them, exploding with derisive accusations at the daughter of Babylon. Again, a reference to Ishtar. He insulted her for her self-assurance and her sexuality, as well as her magical powers and spells. Over what appears to be the independence of the Hebrew women, apparently influenced by the freedom of the women all about them, Isaiah listed all their jewelry and seductive apparel with the greatest contempt and then threatened, the men shall fall by the sword, and thy mighty in war, and she being desolate shall sit upon the ground. And in that day 7 women shall take hold of one man and say, only let us be called by thy name to take away our reproach. Thus the Hebrew prophet looked forward to the day of male glory when all independent women would choose to be the property of a man, as they may have been forced to be in the desert, or as their towns were burnt and their families killed, and the earliest Israelite wives were taken as prisoners of war by the Hebrew tribes. In the struggle for male kinship, Isaiah dreamed of the day that women would say, only let us be called by thy name. In section 8 of the book of Ezekiel, we again find the religion of the goddess under attack. As Ezekiel recalls this event, entering at the temple gate, I broke through a wall, there was a door. A mysterious figure was leading, apparently a messenger from the male deity. The figure said, "Go in and look at the filthy things they are doing inside." I went in and looked. All sorts of images and snakes and repulsive animals and all the idols of the house of Israel drawn on the walls all around. According to Ezekiel, the filthy things the worshippers inside this temple were doing were facing to the east, bowing to the sun, and raising a branch to their nostrils. This was probably a branch of the sacred tree known as the Asherah. Ezekiel continues, he next took me to the north gate of the temple of Yahweh, where women were sitting, weeping for Tammuz. This remark, more clearly than any other, reveals that he was observing the religion of Asheroth or Ishtar still in practice at the temple in Jerusalem. The mysterious figure then said, "Son of man, do you see that?" This appellation, Son of Man, was used repeatedly throughout the book of Ezekiel, perhaps to remind its readers that Levite priests, such as Ezekiel, no longer considered themselves as the sons of women. Later, turning on the women who prayed in this manner, the figure ordered, "And you, son of man, turn to the daughters of your own people who make up prophecies out of their own head, unlike the Levite prophets of Yahweh, who apparently had a direct line with the proper source, prophesy against them." Threats and insults to the native inhabitants of Canaan and the Hebrews who had joined in their customs were not all that was used to frighten and discourage people from following the religion of the Queen of Heaven. For next we read of accounts of cold-blooded massacres, merciless slaughters of those who still refused to accept Yahweh. The Bible itself records that any Hebrew who dared to worship in the ancient religion of the Queen of Heaven and her Baal were the victims of a violent religious persecution. The words and threats of Ezekiel, as well as the other prophets, were translated into murder and destruction, explained as having been commanded by Yahweh. They are recorded in this way in the pages of the Old Testament. And the Lord said unto him, "Go through the midst of Jerusalem and set a mark upon the foreheads of the men that sigh and that cry for all the abominations that are done in the midst thereof." And to the others he said in mine hearing, "Go ye after him through the city and smite, slay utterly, both old and young, both maids and little children and women, but come not near any man upon whom is the mark, and begin at my sanctuary." Then they began at the ancient men who were before the house. And he said unto them, "Defile the house and fill the courts with the slain. Go ye forth." And they went forth and they slew in the city. Ezekiel 9:4-7. An earlier An earlier account of a callous slaughter in the name of Yahweh, aimed at the religion of the goddess, occurred during the reign of Ahab. Elijah exhibited the same self-righteous attitude that throughout history has allowed the commission of mass murder in the name of a principle, whether political, religious, or a combination of the two. Referring to 400 people who worshiped in the ancient religion, the passage states, "And Elijah said unto them, Take the prophets of Baal, let not one of them escape. And they took them, and Elijah brought them down to the brook Kishon and slew them there." This particular passage in the version given in the Revised Standard Version of the Old Testament. But in the New English Bible, published in 1970 by the Bible Societies of Scotland and England, which retranslated many of the old texts from the original Hebrew and Greek, we read the story in a slightly different way. In fact, in this version of the Old Testament, many of the references to Asherah, Ashtaroth, and Asherim are more explicitly explained. In the New English Bible, we read that Elijah confronts the ancient religion as that of Asherah. It tells us in 1 Kings 18:19 that these 400 people were 400 prophets of the goddess Asherah, who are Jezebel's pensioners. It is most evident in the story of Jezebel, who has long been presented as the epitome and symbol of the treacherously evil woman, that her real crime was her refusal to accept the worship of Yahweh, choosing instead the religion of her own parents, that of the Queen of Heaven and her Baal. Her parents, as Queen and King of Sidon, some say Tyre, held high positions in the ancient religion as high priestess and priest. Not only did Jezebel herself follow the ancient religion, but according to the Bible, as a result of her influence, her husband Ahab, a Hebrew king of Israel, adopted the pagan ways as well, erecting Asherim in the temple. Jezebel's supposed crime, that of starting a rumor that resulted in the death of a man, becomes questionable when we realize that it was her husband who actually desired the dead man's property, and it was with letters signed with Ahab's name that she was accused. Jezebel was murdered in the most gruesome manner described in morbid detail in the Bible, surely intended as a warning to all other treacherous women. The execution was carried out by the avenging hero Jehu. But Jehu's motives become frighteningly clear when, after the death of the pagan queen, he arranged a massacre of those who ate at her royal table, and then later claimed the throne of Israel as his own. Shortly after the murder of Jezebel, Jehu called for a solemn assembly of the people who paid homage to Ashtaroth and Baal, tricking them in this way into gathering together at their own temple at an appointed time. The holy shrine was described as being full from one end to the other. It was then reported in the Bible, and when they went to offer sacrifices and burnt offerings, Jehu appointed fourscore men without and said, "If any of the men that I have brought into your hands escape, he that letteth him go, his life shall be for the life of him." So it was recorded in the book of 2 Kings that Jehu and his men murdered every member of the congregation and then finally made a latrine of the building itself. And when the massacre and desecration was completed, Jehu is recorded to have heard Yahweh say, "Thou hast done well that which is right in mine eyes." 2 Kings 10:18 through 31. Then let him write her a bill of divorcement. The evidence is abundant. The religion of Ashtoreth, Asherah, or Anath, and her Baal, and the accompanying female sexual autonomy were the enemies. No method was considered too violent to bring about the desired goals. To clarify even further the underlying goals of the Levites, along these massacres, we confront the rules that the Levite priests declared for all Hebrew women. Upon reading the Levite laws, it becomes apparent that the sexual autonomy of women in the religion of the goddess posed a continual threat. It undermined far-reaching goals of the men, perhaps led or influenced by Indo-European peoples, who viewed women as property and aimed at a society in which male kinship was the rule, as it had long been in the Indo-European nations. This in turn required that each woman be retained as the possession of one man, leaving no doubt as to the identity of the father of the children she might bear, especially of her sons. But male kinship lines remained impossible as long as women were allowed to function as sexually independent people, continuing to bear children whose paternity was not known or considered to be of any importance. Laws, speeches, and even the divine word had apparently been insufficient when freedom had been known so long. Thus, severe punishments were designed and meted out to bring about the total sexual control of Hebrew women. Any deviation was sin, in many cases punishable by disgraceful and agonizing death. Though these laws appear in the books of Leviticus and Deuteronomy, said to have been written at the time of Moses, Bible scholars generally date their writings to between 1000 and 600 BC. According to the Levite laws, all women were to remain virgins until marriage. Once legally married, a woman was to relate sexually only to the one man who was designated as her husband, probably a man chosen by her father. This husband may already have possessed or could acquire in the future any number of other wives or concubines and was free to add a new one at any time. In Leviticus 20 and 10, we read that if a woman committed adultery, both she and her lover were to be put to death. In Deuteronomy, the Levites wrote of the Israelite bride. But if this thing be true, and tokens of virginity not found for the damsel, then they shall bring out the damsel to the door of her father's house, and the men of the city shall stone her with stones, that she die, because she hath wrought folly in Israel, to play the whore in her father's house. So shalt thou put away evil from among you. Deuteronomy 22:20 through 22. Thus, a young Hebrew girl might be dragged from the house and brutally stoned to death for having made love, or even for having lost her virginity through some other activity or accident, while her Canaanite contemporaries would have been considered holy for taking part in the sacred sexual customs. So determined were the Levites that a reverent regard for the paternity of children be developed that among them even violent rape was equated with marriage, much as it was among the Indo-European controlled Assyrians. In Levite law, the rape of a virgin was honored as a declaration of ownership and brought about a forced marriage. As the victim of rape, a woman automatically lost the right to continue her life as a single woman or to become a wife in a more carefully arranged and probably more desirable marriage. The law reads, if a man find a damsel that is a virgin, which is not betrothed, and lay hold on her, and they be found, then the man that lay with her shall give unto the damsel's father 50 shekels of silver, and she shall be his wife. Deuteronomy 22 and 28 through 29. For Levite daughters it was decreed, and the daughter of any priest, if she profane herself by playing the whore, she profaneth her father, and shall be burnt with fire. Leviticus 21 and 9. Since it was the Levite priests who wrote the laws, this willingness to burn their own daughters to death perhaps most certainly reveals the intensity of the Levite attitude toward the sexual autonomy of women. Perhaps just as astonishing is the law that tells us that if the victim of a rape was a married or betrothed woman, she was to be killed for having been raped. The law states that if a betrothed woman or a married woman was sexually violated, she and the man were both to be stoned to death. Deuteronomy 22, verses 23 through 25. The rape was regarded as an affront to the male who owned her. Only in the deserted countryside might a woman be excused for having been raped, since perhaps she had called for help and had not been heard. Through the Bible, repeatedly, announced that a woman who dared to make love to a man other than her husband was a shameful and profane degradation to the entire faith. Hebrew men went about honorably collecting as many women as they could economically afford. The records of the Hebrew kings reveal that they kept large harems, and most Hebrew men appear to have taken several wives. Yet each of these women was expected to be totally faithful to the fragment of the husband to whom she was assigned. A lack of fidelity on the part of the male appears to have been taken for granted, unless the other woman was already married or betrothed. This was regarded as sinful because it was a legal infringement upon the property of some other man. It was hardly a romantic fidelity for both partners of the marriage that was deemed as important or sacred, but only for the woman that premarital virginity and sexual fidelity became moral issues, attitudes we see reflected even today. But the position of a married woman who had been faithful was also precarious. In Deuteronomy 24:1, the plight of the married woman was made clear. When a man hath taken a wife, and it come to pass that she find no favor in his eyes, because he hath found some uncleanness in her, then let him write her a bill of divorcement and give it in her hand, and send her out of his house. As we read previously, under the Levite law, only the husband could ask for or demand divorce. In fact, all he had to do was write a note. We may see this as a very different society from that of the Sumerian Ashnuna, where if a man took a second woman after the first had borne children, he was to be put out of the house without any possessions. Here, the advantages of male kinship and male inheritance lines, not only for royalty or the priesthood, but even for the average male, become clear. A woman who had lived in the house with her husband, probably given birth to children, performed domestic services, perhaps added to or enhanced the value of the house, property, and land by her efforts, no matter what her age or state of health, had no legal rights or claims to any of it. She could simply be handed a notice and sent on her way. The husband then assumed ownership of all the products of her time and efforts, and if he had not already done so, probably soon afterward replaced her with another wife or two. Having lost her virginity, she was probably nearly worthless as marriage material. Such divorces may not have happened frequently, though we have no records with which to judge. But the laws allowing such divorce probably resulted in the woman, fearful at the possibility of being dismissed, becoming a submissive servant, the archetype of the good wife, who obediently, smilingly caters to her husband's slightest whim or desire. I have come to destroy the works of the female. Over the centuries, the suppression and persecution of the religion of the female deity continued. In the Avodah Zarah, a book of the Hebrew Talmud compiled in about the 5th century AD, directions were given to the pious worshiper so that he might understand how to destroy the powers of an idol. This could be done by knocking off the tip of its ear or nose, which may account for the missing noses of so many statues. The entire book was filled with specific laws and regulations describing the relationship the Hebrews were to have with the idolaters. The civilizations that worshiped the goddess, which had flourished for thousands of years, bringing with them in earliest times inventions and methods of agriculture, medicine, architecture, metallurgy, wheeled vehicles, ceramics, textiles, and written language, were gradually stamped out. Though the Indo-Europeans had initiated a great many changes, it was later the duty of every Hebrew and then of every Christian to suppress and destroy the worship of the female deity wherever it still existed. If the Hebrews followed the commands in Deuteronomy, the massacres described in the Old Testament may have been only a symbolic portion of the murder and destruction that was actually committed. As the literature and tenets of the Levite Hebrew religion were incorporated into the new faith, which eventually developed as Christianity, the persecution of the religion of the goddess continued. The power and influence of the new church grew, Levite law now juxtaposed to a revised image of the familiar legend of the mother and the dying son. And with it came the even more extreme suppression of the female religion. In 1971, R.E. Witt wrote Isis in the Greco-Roman World. In it, he points out that the worship of the goddess as Isis and Artemis, names that had become widely used by the time of Christ, was the target of the Apostle Paul. He explains that both in Palestine and in Syria, as in Asia Minor, on which so much of Paul's apostolic zeal was concentrated. The cult of the female deities was deep-rooted and very old. The sermon attacking the idolatry shown by the Ephesians towards the great goddess Artemis has not survived in detail. We need not doubt that Paul had taken the measure of the female deities, of whose influence he had long experienced, especially Artemis and Isis. Paul could tell that here was a dangerous rival. Clearly, the Pauline view of Isaacism, the worship of Isis, okay, was penetratingly critical. Paul's world was a patriarchy. His religion was Christological and monotheistic, and God was found in fashion as a man. Isis was female, the obvious foe of the church in its early ecumenical struggles was the cult of Isis and her temple companions. This is made clear even before the death blow which paganism received from Theodosius. Witt also quotes perhaps the most revealing line in the story of the destruction of the goddess religion, telling us that Clement of Alexandria reproduces a saying from the gospel according to the Egyptians. Christ's words are interesting, and in such a context, they are almost certainly directed against the current worship of Isis. I have come to destroy the works of the female. In about AD 300, the Emperor Constantine brought an end to the ancient sanctuary of Ashtaroth at Afaka and generally suppressed the worship of Ashtoreth throughout Canaan, claiming that it was immoral. He is said to have seen a vision of Christ during a battle and to have heard the words, "In this sign, conquer," strange words for the Prince of Peace. In AD 380, the Emperor Theodosius closed down the temple of the goddess at Eleusis. The temple of the goddess in Rome and the seventh wonder of the world. The temple of the goddess, then known as Artemis or Diana, at Ephesus in western Anatolia. It was said that he despised the religion of women. This great Christian emperor may be better remembered for his massacre of 7,000 people in Thessalonica. In Athens, the Parthenon of the Acropolis, a sacred site of the goddess since the Mycenaean times of 1300 BC, was converted into a Christian church in AD 450. In the 5th century, the Emperor Justinian converted the remaining temples of Isis into Christian churches. In Arabia of the 7th century, Muhammad brought an end to the national worship of the sun goddess Al-Lat and the goddess known as Al-Uzza, whose name might have been related to the ancient Azit. Professor J.B. Pritchard writes that Al-Lat was originally much the same deity as Ashera in Arabic religion. Muhammad brought about the worship of Allah as the supreme God. Allah actually means God, as Al-Lat means goddess. Though it is not always realized in Western society, Muhammad incorporated many of the legends and attitudes of the Old and New Testaments into the Muslim Quran, the Bible of Islam. In the Quran, Surah 431 tells us men have authority over women because God has made the one superior to the other and because they spend their wealth to maintain them. So good women are obedient, guarding the unseen parts as God has guarded them. As late as the 16th century AD, Hebrew scholars compiled a text known as the Kabbalah. The name of Lilith, once described in a Sumerian tablet as the hand of Inanna, who brought men into the temple, a name also found in some Hebrew literature as the first wife of Adam, who refused to lie beneath him and to obey his commands, appeared once again. In the Hebrew Kabbalah, Lilith was presented as the symbol of evil, the female devil. G. Shalom wrote that in the Zohar, a part of the Kabbalah, it was stated that Lilith, queen of the demons, or the demons of her retinue, do their best to provoke men to sexual acts without benefit of a woman, their aim being to make themselves bodies from the lost seed. It gave the warning that Lilith hovered about, just waiting for available sperm from which she created demons and illegitimate children. The Kabbalah cautioned that with the help of Lilith, the illegitimate children come. Was this a remote reference to the ancient Kadishtu, their image now embodied in the wicked demon Lilith? The major factor in avoiding the dangerous Lilith was once again a matter of inheritance. This is apparent in the description of the actions of the illegitimate children once their father has died. Wishing along with the other children to have a part in the deceased as their father, they tug and pluck at him so that he feels the pain, and God himself, when he sees this noxious offspring by the corpse, is reminded of the dead man's sins. All the illegitimate children that a man has begotten with demons in the course of his life appear after his death to take part in the mourning for him and in his funeral. The demons claim their inheritance on this occasion along with the other sons of the deceased and try to harm the legitimate children. We have seen that the orders for the destruction of the religion of the goddess were built into the very canons and laws of the male religions that replaced it. It is clear that the ancient reverence for the female deity did not simply cease to be, but that its disappearance was gradually brought about, initially by the Indo-European invaders, later by the Hebrews, eventually by the Christians, and even further by the Mohammedans. Along with the ultimate acceptance of the male religions throughout a large part of the world, the precepts of sexual morality, that is, premarital virginity and marital fidelity for women, were incorporated into the attitudes and laws of the societies which embraced them. There is no question about the antagonism expressed by the Levite patriarchs toward the religion of the female deity. Accounts, perhaps originally remembered in oral form, taken from other Hebrew scripts or even some other language, became part of the biblical text, which are assumed to have first been written as we know them in about 1000 BC. From the time of Moses onward, the Levites appear to have made the decision to destroy the shrines and sanctuaries of the earlier worship. From that time on until the fall of the two Hebrew nations in 722 and 586 BC, we read in the Bible of the actual massacres and desecrations claimed to be executed at the command of the male deity. We cannot avoid observing the continual emphasis upon female sexuality as acceptable only when women were safely designated as the property of one specific male, and that any deviation from that rule was denounced as harlotry or adultery and subject to punishment by death, making the sexual customs of the older religion rather difficult to follow. It is then perhaps not overly speculative to suggest that the myth of Adam and Eve, the myth which Professor Shira tells us shows evidence of having been produced in scholarly circles, may have been intentionally written and included in the creation story of the Bible as yet another assault upon the goddess religion. Within the legend of the creation of all existence and life by Yahweh, the story which supposedly explained what happened at the very beginning of time, the image of woman as the dangerously seductive temptress who brought about the fall of all humanity may have been inserted. Knowing all that we do about the sacred sexual customs in the religion of the goddess, the continual presence of these customs among the Hebrews, even in Jerusalem, the use of dragon or serpent myths, often in conjunction with creation stories, by the Indo-Europeans and the vestiges of the Leviathan myth in the Old Testament, we may gain a most clarifying and enlightening insight into the symbolism and message contained in the biblical myth of Adam and Eve. The examination of the symbolic imagery of the goddess religion and that of the Genesis tale of creation in the following chapter provides some surprising information. We may begin to understand what it means when the Bible tells us that Eve defied the male deity and instead accepted the word and advice of the serpent. We may indeed find that the seemingly innocent myth of paradise and how the world began was actually carefully constructed and propagated to keep women in their place, the place assigned to them by the Levite tribe of biblical Canaan. Whew, okay, and with that, I'm going to end it. Catch me later for chapter 10, Unraveling the Myth of Adam and Eve. So thanks again for listening, everybody. This is a very, very interesting book. Again, the link is in the description if you'd like to purchase it from Amazon. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and share the video. Thank you much. Shalom, peace be unto you, and assalamu alaikum.